Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. Today, I have German Karaivanov from GTreasury. Our topic is connectivity and API technology, GTreasury's strategy for connectivity. Welcome to the podcast, German.
Thank you, Craig. I'm super excited to be here today.
Technology for connectivity has been developing over the years from old versions to newer and newer versions. APIs are a very large topic and hot topic of conversation. In some ways, APIs are all the rage. Others have a more skeptical view of adoption and the change that they'll bring. Maybe you could give us a background on your work experience and your role at GTreasury.
Sure. So I'm the VP of product here at GTreasury. I have over 16 years of product management experience working at some of the super big banks in North America and financial services companies. My background has been really exclusively focused on cash management and payments.
This idea of connectivity and API technology, this section I think we'd call differences in what matters. Maybe we could start with technology differences. We'll move into practical differences and then how that matters to companies, what makes a sense. But starting with technology differences, what are the core technological differences of SFTP or file-based transfers or connectivity methods and API-based approaches? What's similar and what's different?
That's a great question, Craig. So let's start with some of the core differences, as you said. If you think about an API versus an SFTP. So with an API, you're actually talking from one system directly to another and trying to exchange the data. And so you have that direct connectivity between those two systems. If you think about the file exchange method, that's a bit different. So with the file exchange, what you're doing is you're extracting data from one system, you're putting it somewhere, and then you're sending that file with the data using an SFTP to another place that's sitting on the other end of the receiving channel. And in that other place, it doesn't go directly into the system. It's sitting somewhere in a file folder. And from there, the actual system that needs the data has to pick it up and ingest it. So if you see, the key difference there is no direct system to system data exchange. And then there's also multiple steps to actually get the data out and get the data in when you compare that to the SFTP. Another key difference there that I'll mention is the integration of those and how you manage the integration. The SFTP route, really, if you're a treasurer or treasury management system trying to integrate with an SFTP method, typically what happens is the file you're receiving doesn't really meet the expectations of what you have on your end. So you have to do some file mapping and maybe file transformation in order to be able to ingest that. And there's testing that you'll be dependent on whoever's sending you the file. And for example, if you're doing a bank integration, you have to make sure you have bank testing resources that are helping you with the testing once you do the mapping and file transformation on your end. When you do the API connectivity, especially if you're working with a treasury management system, the treasury management system can do all the API mapping on your behalf. And then you as a treasurer, all you need to do is enter your API authentication credential within the treasury management system, and your implementation is done right there. So there is no testing you have to do with the bank. There is no mapping that you have to do with the bank as well. Much faster in terms of actually getting onboarded on an API versus file exchange.
Yeah, that's getting a little bit into the practical differences too, right? Getting up to speed sooner. Onto the technology differences. Here's a question. So files come in with an SFTP. Let's say it's an MT message type coming from Swift, and there's some missing data. They've missed a page. Or there's an unbalanced file, or the file totals don't match the detail records that are sent. Somehow some data is lost in a SFTP transfer. Before that's loaded, some of that information is oftentimes checked by the system. And if it's out of balance, it's suspended. It's not loaded into the database. So there's a ability to prevent that. How is that handled in an API world if there's missing data or some type of problem with the data?
Good question. So typically what we'll have with the API is you have fields that are required and then fields that are optional within the API as you're receiving the data. And if knows that data is missing, he can go back and actually do another request or an API to gather the data and pull it. So there is no manual intervention that needs to happen there on the client to redrop the file or resend the file. You can automatically have the system go back to the bank, for example, and do another ask for the data to be sent to you.
We started talking about the practical differences where you talked about it's faster to implement. But from the treasurer perspective, from a non-technological perspective, what are some of the other differences? Faster to implement. What else matters?
I think the other thing that really matters to treasurers is actually I can get data whenever I need it. So if you think about the file exchange, with the file exchange, you're dependent on when the bank is scheduled to create the file and send the file out. And typically that'll happen only a few times a day. If you think about an API, as a treasurer, you can say, hey, I want the data now, so you can just initiate a one-off request to get the data right now, or you can actually have a scheduled pull of the data with the API and say, hey, I want to pull the data every 15 minutes, for example, and get the data into my system. So much more quicker availability of data and more recent data.
So if we're looking at banking data, information that comes in, they have a lot of different systems. Much of the banking process at many banks is geared towards once a day. And so prior day information gets delivered early in the morning, has all of the transactions fed from multiple systems, from wire transfer platforms, maybe check platforms, low value transfer platforms, other areas. When we think about current day, usually current day information tends to be limited, right? It's pulling from a particular platform and not, for most banks, all platforms aren't feeding into the interface area that an API or a SFTP process would work for current day. Is that an accurate way to put it or concern, or is that, how should we think about the fact that some of the cycle time of banks are daily, not real time, when we think about real time connections like APIs?
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. And this would depend bank by bank, right? Some of the banks are actually moving to providing more current day data by either posting like not hold on accounts, but posting actually entries to show that a transaction has happened, even if the money has not been moved yet. So banks are actually very conscious that they do have some of the limitations, and they're trying to bring more data to the current day posting. But each of them will be different bank by bank. So I think what is important from a client perspective, when they think about current day data, whether it's an API or whether it's a file exchange, they have to know the limits of some of their banks and know what to expect. And then obviously, I think this is just a no-brainer for all of the treasurers. You have to make sure you're getting the prior day data as well on the next day, so you have the full set of data that's coming from the bank. But you still have the ability to make some very important decisions with the current day data that's coming from the bank.
Perfect. The other question here is, as we think about how this matters to treasury groups, is it more important for them that it's easier to get more connectivity, or that it's faster and you get better information? Maybe not real time, but faster information, and that's important. How would you weight that? You said easier process, better information.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So it depends. Okay, so let me give you two different examples. So one example is, hey, I'm a treasury department. I have my own internal system that I use for connectivity. I don't use a TMS. Okay, in that scenario, both for file exchange and both for an API, you actually have to bring your IT resources to help you with the connectivity and getting the data. Now, if you're using a TMS, it's a bit different. So once you have your TMS stood up and connected to that, the TMS will connect on your behalf with the API to the bank, for example. So there is no treasury department, technology department needs from a company to actually do any connectivity there. So no need for IT resources, much faster onboarding to get the API working because your TMS provider has done it on your behalf. And then the data will be available for you there in your single source of truth within the TMS.
All right. So when we think about the mindset and implications, or maybe we should think about the mindset and implications of APIs. How are we to think about these? Just saying API, and this is where I think there's some negative views on APIs, that there's hype about it. Hey, we got an API. That doesn't magically make every connection work out of the box across tens of thousands of banks, across dozens of ERPs. I know you've talked about in our other conversation that there's maybe a library of connections. You might not have used that word, but how do you grow your library of connections? And you have I'll call it an API suite that you're building out. How do we think about that? And what types of connections are you building in your API suite?
Yeah. So before we talk about our API suite, I want to go back to what you're saying earlier related to hype about APIs. Is there hype about APIs? Absolutely. And I think there are also some misconceptions. Okay. So let's talk about bank APIs. When people say bank APIs, they're thinking, you know what, they're standardized. They're just transaction data and balances that we're getting from the bank. Well, I got to tell you, you're wrong. Okay. Yes, it's transaction and balance data, but these APIs do not have any global standards across the banks for treasury data. So what's happened is each bank has gone and developed their own flavor, their own version of an API, so you can get treasury data out of the bank. And what ends up happening is bank one versus bank two, they have different limitations or different capability of those API, even though you're providing the same data. Perfect example, one bank might say, hey, I have a limit that with an API call, you can only bring in 10,000 transactions at a time. And then you just got to initiate another API call for the rest of the transactions that you have as a company, right? As you're building connectivity with these banks, you have to be aware of those limitations and you have to build for those limitations to make sure you get all the necessary data for the treasurer. Each bank has their own different authentication method with their API as well. So what we're doing on the GTreasury side, we're building our own connectivity suite for APIs. We've created an internal tool that we call the Clear Connect Gateway, and that tool enables us to do a couple of things. So first of all, it actually enables us to map the different bank APIs to the GTreasury system without any development effort. So a non-developer person, somebody from implementation teams or somebody from our product team will go and use that tool and will map the bank API for bank one using a graphical user interface and some text as well. And once that is mapped, they can go and map bank two based on their specifics. And what will happen is we build all these connections with the banks on the behalf of our clients, the treasurers, of course. And when they want to use them, they don't have to do anything in terms of mapping or building the API in order to use them. All they have to do is get their credentials from the bank. It's completely self-serve onboarding within GTreasury. They go to the specific screen of GTreasury, they put in the bank credentials, and they say how often they want to pull the data, and they're good to go, and they can start pulling data from the bank the same day.
Okay, so that addresses the speed issue, right? It's much more configuration. It's a simpler configuration as opposed to development and configuration. German, thanks for this discussion on connectivity and API technology. I want to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts for the technologists out there in finance or for the treasury professionals about connectivity and API tech.
I think the best thing as a treasurer technologist is don't always trust everything you hear per se. Make sure you're doing your own research and you're aware of the limitations and benefits of different connectivity methods or different technologies that are available out there. So make sure you do your research. And if you're struggling to find out what's true and what's not, or you need some advice, lots of experts in the field like Craig, or if you're a treasury management customer of GTreasury, come and talk to your account managers. You'll get help and you'll get advice.
All right. Thanks, German.
You're welcome, Craig. It's been a pleasure.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.